Today we're going to delve into a critical and often brutal element of the Soviet Union's resistance to Nazi Germany during World War II, the scorched earth policy. Imagine this: the Nazi war machine is advancing across vast stretches of Soviet territory in 1941 during Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's plan is to seize land and resources swiftly, but instead the Germans find barren landscapes and decimated infrastructure at every turn. The Soviet Union's scorched earth policy was both a calculated and severe response to this invasion. Through it, they aimed to strip the German forces of any resources and create conditions so harsh that holding conquered territories would become nearly impossible. Today, we'll break down this policy, examining its implementation, its impact on the Nazi advance, and the far-reaching consequences it had on both military operations and civilians in the Soviet territories. The prelude to the scorched earth policy was in June 1941. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, aiming to conquer the Soviet Union. The Germans' motivation was clear. They saw living space and viewed the USSR as a wellspring of resources vital to sustaining the Nazi regime. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, recognized the gravity of the threat that was now incoming. Determined to slow down or even sabotage the German advance, the Soviet leadership decided to weaponize their own land. This scorched earth strategy was, in its essence, ruthlessly straightforward. They would leave nothing usable in their wake, ensuring that the invading German forces would be met with desolate land, barren fields, and empty factories. This wasn't a new idea in Russian history. It had deep roots, harking back to the 1812 campaign against Napoleon, where Russian forces employed similar tactics. Now, in the 20th century, they would apply it on an even greater scale and even larger areas of destruction. As the Germans advanced rapidly across the Soviet frontier, Soviet military and local authorities mobilized swiftly to implement this strategy. This meant the systematic destruction of infrastructure, resources, and anything else that could possibly aid the invaders. Imagine entire regions ablaze as Soviet forces set fire to crops, factories, and homes, forcing the Germans into increasing hostile territory. Soviet forces then obliterated critical infrastructure from bridges and railways to roads and communication lines. This forced German troops to reconstruct or repair these essential networks, slowing their advance significantly and wasting resources. Soviet soldiers and civilians burned fields together. They levelled farmhouses and eliminated entire towns. With food and shelter in short supply, the German forces faced worsening conditions, especially as winter approached. This was particularly true in areas like Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. These regions were actually extremely vital to the Germans, and they were now becoming extremely barren. They also sabotaged factories and power plants, which were rendered useless. They flooded mines, and any equipment that could not be moved was destroyed or dismantled. In some cases, even chemical charges were used to leave nothing usable behind for the German invaders. The impact on German logistics was immediate and substantial. The vast distances of Soviet territory had already put a strain on Operation Barbarossa, and the scorched earth policy compounded these issues further. The stretched out German forces quickly found themselves dependent on long, vulnerable supply chains extending all the way back to Germany. As Soviet partisans attacked these lines and resources on the ground grew scarcer, the German situation became more precarious by the minute. Soviet railways also operated on a different gauge to the German ones, so when the Soviets destroyed these tracks, German engineers had to convert the rail gauges, an arduous, time-consuming process. This not only hindered their mobility, but also prevented supplies from reaching the front lines efficiently. They were also deprived of local supplies, German soldiers enduring starvation, exposure, and inadequate shelter. The shortages took their toll on morale, and more critically, on combat effectiveness, as German troops realised that the swift advance they expected was turning into a quagmire and an absolutely gruelling campaign of attrition. While effectively a military plan, the scorched earth policy also led to immense suffering among the Soviet civilian population. One key component of the Germans' plan was the hunger plan, which involved exploiting Soviet agriculture for the benefit of Germany. In response, millions of acres of farmland were either destroyed or abandoned, preventing the Germans from utilising these resources. The civilians in the occupied areas faced food shortages and were often forced to relocate. with their crops being burned and livestock slaughtered, and homes even being razed. This created a massive refugee crisis, forcing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of civilians to have to migrate into areas where they could attempt to survive, and with winter bearing down, this became almost impossible. The destruction led to lasting consequences as well in these regions. Both agriculture and industry would be slow to recover after the war, resulting in long-term economic and social challenges for everyone in these areas. One of the most impressive components of the Scorched Earth policy was the relocation of Soviet industry to the east beyond the Germans' reach. Thousands of factories and skilled workers were relocated eastward to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Entire plants were dismantled and moved across thousands of kilometers under harsh conditions. By 1942 and 43, these relocated factories were fully operational, producing tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and other critical war materials. This ensured that the Red Army could continue to equip itself for both defensive and counter-offensive operations, setting the stage for key battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. The Scorched Earth policy was not only a military tactic, but a powerful tool for morale and propaganda. Soviet propaganda portrayed the Scorched Earth policy as an essential sacrifice for the defence of the motherland. Civilians were encouraged to view each act of destruction as a contribution to defeating the Germans. This installed a fierce resolve amongst the Soviet people, reminding them that they were fighting not only a war for survival, but for liberation. And to the German forces, the policy sent a clear signal. The Soviet Union was committed to resisting at any cost. The campaign that Hitler had promised would be a swift victory was turning into a grueling ordeal, one with no end in sight. While the Scorched Earth policy imposed harsh tolls on Soviet civilians, its contribution to the Soviet Union's eventual victory cannot be overstated. The denial of resources and shelter, whilst facing harsh winter conditions in a barren land, made the German army become extremely vulnerable. Their morale fell, their supply lines became stretched to breaking point, and by the time of critical battles like Stalingrad, many were undersupplied and demoralised. The policy also demonstrated the Soviet Union's resilience and strategic depth. It showed that the USSR could adapt and endure extreme measures in defence of its own territory, ultimately helping to repel the invasion. And today the Scorched Earth policy remains a powerful symbol of Soviet sacrifice and resilience. Despite its harshness, it underscored the Soviets' resolve and inspired both Soviet citizens and international allies, leaving a lasting mark on the legacy of the Soviet victory in World War II. In conclusion, the Soviet Scorched Earth policy in World War II was a brutal yet decisive strategy that effectively slowed and weakened the German advance. It showcased the Soviet Union's willingness to go to extraordinary lengths to defend its territory, proving that they were a force to be reckoned with. This policy, combined with other Soviet strategies, helped to turn the tide of the war and marked a significant chapter in the Soviet Union's monumental struggle and eventual victory over Nazi Germany. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It was an interesting one to research. I also learned quite a bit, and it really was a brutal tactic, but that was quite important. And it kind of shows that sometimes it takes such brutality to win a war. But you also have to remember the biggest part of defense is not to destroy what you're defending whilst you're defending it. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone, and you guys have a fantastic evening.